The rain always seemed to fall a little harder in the north of England, a constant, gray drizzle that soaked into the brickwork of the terraced houses and turned the cobblestones slick and black. In the town of Hyde, people moved with their heads down against the chill, finding comfort in the small, warm rituals of their lives. A cup of tea by the fire, a chat with the neighbor over the fence, and, for the sick and the elderly, the comforting, authoritative knock on the door from their beloved local GP. When that door opened, and the figure in the tweed jacket stepped out of the mist and into the hallway, a collective sigh of relief would wash over the household. He was here, the good doctor, the man with the bushy beard and the piercing eyes that seemed to see right through you, yet held a reservoir of infinite patience. He was the pillar of the community, the man who held the keys to life and death, and in Hyde, his word was law. To question him was unthinkable. To doubt him was a sin. He was the one who sat by the bedside when the end was near, holding a hand, offering a soothing word, and promising that there would be no pain. But the people of Hyde didn't know who they had let into their parlors. They didn't know that behind the spectacles and the gentle bedside manner lived a darkness so profound, so ancient and cold, that it defied all human understanding. They saw a healer, but what walked among them was a hollow shell of a man, filled only with a craving for control that was as addictive as the drugs he carried in his black medical bag. To understand the monster, you have to look back, long before he arrived in this quiet town, back to a boy watching his world crumble. Harold Shipman wasn't born a killer, or perhaps he was, and it just took the right trigger to wake the sleeping beast. He was a bright boy, a favorite son, suffocated by the intense, overbearing love of a mother who saw him as her golden ticket. Vera Shipman. She was the center of his universe, the sun around which his entire existence orbited. But then, the darkness came for her. Lung cancer is a cruel thief. It strips away dignity, it steals breath, and it fills a home with the heavy, metallic scent of suffering. Young Harold watched her wither. He watched the woman who controlled everything lose control of her own body. The pain was a living thing in that house, a screaming presence that nothing could silence. Nothing, that is, until the doctor arrived. Harold would sit in the corner of the sick room, his eyes wide, watching the ritual. The doctor would prepare the syringe, the liquid catching the light, and then the injection. It was magic, pure, dark magic. In seconds, the agony vanished. His mother's face would smooth out, the screaming in the room would stop, and a blissful, chemical peace would descend. Morphine. It wasn't just medicine to the boy watching from the shadows. It was power. It was the power to turn off suffering, the power to dictate the terms of existence. He saw how his mother looked at the doctor, not with gratitude, but with reverence. The doctor was a god, and Harold wanted that. He wanted to be the one holding the needle. He wanted to be the one who decided when the pain stopped. He carried that obsession with him like a secret lover. He pushed himself through medical school, driven by an arrogance that isolated him from his peers. They were there to learn to heal. He was there to learn to rule. He viewed others with a quiet disdain, a superior smirk hidden behind a facade of diligence. But the power he craved came with a price. He began to sample the magic himself. Pethidine, a synthetic opioid, a cousin to the morphine that had eased his mother into the void. He started taking it, feeling the rush of omnipotence, the numbing of the world's sharp edges. It made him feel invincible, untouchable. He was a junior doctor, high on his own supply, forging prescriptions, lying to colleagues. dancing on the edge of a cliff. He thought he was smarter than them all. He thought he could weave a web of lies so tight that no one would ever see the spider sitting in the center. But the cracks started to show early. The blackouts, the erratic behavior. He was caught, stripped of his dignity, forced into rehab. A normal man would have been humbled. A normal man would have looked into the abyss and stepped back. But Harold Shipman was not a normal man. He didn't see his capture as a lesson. He saw it as a mistake in his calculations. He learned not to stop, but to be better at hiding, to be quieter, to be more patient. He rebuilt his life, put the mask back on, tighter this time. He found his way to hide, a place where people still respected the old ways, where a doctor was above suspicion. He brought his wife, his children, and his black bag. He embedded himself into the soil of the town, growing roots deep into the community's trust. He became the good doctor again. But the hunger hadn't gone away. It had just evolved. He no longer just wanted to numb the pain. He wanted to do what the doctor had done for his mother. He wanted to escort them to the door of death and push them through. The beast was awake, it was hungry, and it was wearing a stethoscope. The hospital ward at night is a strange, liminal place. It is a world suspended between the living and the dead, lit by the harsh, buzzing fluorescence of strip lights that turn human skin a sickly shade of gray. The air is thick with the smell of floor wax and antiseptic, a scent meant to mask the underlying odors of sickness and decay. In the early 1970s, at the Pontefract General Infirmary, a young, ambitious doctor walked these corridors with a stride that was just a little too confident, his shoes clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. Harold Shipman was just starting out, fresh-faced and eager, but the darkness inside him had already taken root. It was no longer a seedling. It was a hungry vine, wrapping itself around his heart, squeezing out empathy, and replacing it with a cold, calculating curiosity. He was supposed to be learning to save lives. But in the quiet hours, when the senior consultants were asleep in their beds, Shipman was learning something else entirely. He was learning how easy it was to extinguish a life. We often think of serial killers as monsters who hunt in the dark alleys, preying on the weak and the isolated. But Shipman was different. He hunted in the light. He hunted in the very place where people felt safest. And while his later reputation was built on the quiet murders of elderly women, the truth of his early days is far more harrowing. It reveals a man who didn't discriminate, a predator who saw every vulnerable soul as a potential test subject. The most chilling story from this time, a story that haunts the archives of the official inquiry, is not about a grandmother at the end of her life, but about a child. A little girl, barely 4 years old, named Susie. She was a fragile thing, suffering from cerebral palsy, admitted to the hospital with a chest infection. She was helpless, dependent entirely on the care of strangers. Imagine the scene. A worried mother, exhausted from days of keeping vigil by her daughter's bedside. She hasn't slept, hasn't eaten properly. The young doctor, Dr. Shipman, enters the room. He is calm, reassuring. He smiles that practiced, gentle smile. He tells the mother to go, just for a moment. "Go get a cup of tea," he might have said, his voice dropping to a soothing baritone. "Take a break. I'll watch over her." The mother hesitates, looking at her little girl, but the doctor's authority is absolute. He is the expert. He is the savior. So she trusts him. She steps out of the room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, leaving her child alone with the man in the white coat. 10 minutes. That was all it took. 10 minutes for a mother to walk down a corridor, pour a cup of vending machine coffee, and walk back. But in those 10 minutes, the universe shifted. Inside the room, Shipman didn't check the girl's vitals. He didn't adjust her blankets. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a syringe filled with a lethal dose of morphine. There was no hesitation, no trembling hand. It was an act of clinical efficiency. He injected the child, watching the life drain from her tiny body not with horror, but with a detached fascination. He watched the chest stop rising. He watched the struggle cease. When the mother returned, coffee in hand, the room was silent. "She's just drifted off," he might have said, or perhaps he simply broke the news that her heart had given out. The devastation of the parents was absolute, a grief so heavy it crushed the air out of their lungs. But amidst the tears and the wailing, not a single person pointed a finger at the young doctor standing solemnly in the corner. Why would they? Doctors save children, they don't kill them. He signed the death certificate with a steady hand. Cause of death, pneumonia. A lie written in ink, sealing the truth in a coffin the size of a doll. This was the moment the final shackle of morality shattered. He realized that the white coat was not just a uniform. It was a cloak of invisibility. He could kill a child in a busy hospital, with nurses just outside the door, and walk away a hero who had done his best. The power was intoxicating. It was better than the drugs he had been injecting into his own veins. He was playing God, and God, it seemed, answered to no one. By 1977, the shadows of his past in Pontefract were far behind him, or so it seemed. Harold Shipman arrived in the town of Hyde, a working-class community in Greater Manchester, looking for a fresh start. He joined the Donnybrook Medical Center, a busy practice that sat at the heart of the town. To the people of Hyde, he wasn't a recovering addict or a man with a questionable history. He was a godsend. In an era where medicine was becoming increasingly impersonal, where doctors were starting to look more at their watches than their patients, Shipman was a throwback to a golden age. He was the architect of a perfect illusion, meticulously constructing the persona of the good, old-fashioned GP. He worked harder than anyone else. He was the first to arrive in the morning, unlocking the doors before the mist had cleared from the streets, and the last to leave at night, his office light burning like a beacon in the darkness. He didn't just treat illnesses, he courted the community. He learned the names of his patients' grandchildren. He asked about their gardens, their holidays, their petty grievances with the council. He made them feel seen. For the elderly women of Hyde, the widows, the lonely, the ones often invisible to the rest of the world, Dr. Shipman became the most important man in their lives. He was charming, arrogant, yes, but in a way that felt reassuring, like a stern father who knew best. If Dr. Shipman said it, it was gospel. But this benevolence was a trap. It was the grooming of an entire town. He was securing his hunting ground, ensuring that when the bodies started to drop, the grief would be directed at the tragedy of death, not the doctor standing over the corpse. In 1992, his hunger for total control drove him to leave the group practice and set up his own surgery on Market Street. This was a crucial move. In a group practice, there were other doctors, prying eyes, colleagues who might notice if too many cremation forms were crossing a single desk. But at Market Street, he was the king of his own castle. He hired loyal staff, a receptionist who adored him, and created a fortress where his word was the only law. The surgery itself became a place of worship. Patients would queue up, singing his praises in the waiting room. "He's marvelous," they would say. "He came out to see me on a Sunday. He gave me something for the pain, and it worked instantly. They didn't know that the something was often a lethal cocktail of diamorphine stockpiled from the deceased or forged prescriptions. The killing became rhythmic, almost mundane in its regularity. He would target the vulnerable, often killing them in their own homes during an unsolicited visit. He would sit in their armchairs, chat about the weather, and then offer them a pick-me-up to help with their weary hearts or aching joints. They trusted him implicitly. They would roll up their sleeves, offering their veins to the man who had brought them so much comfort. And as the needle slid in, as the cold rush of the drug stopped their hearts, the last thing they saw was the face of their trusted friend. He watched them die in the comfort of their own living rooms, surrounded by their family photos and porcelain figurines. And then the performance would begin. He would call the family, his voice heavy with faux sorrow. "I'm so sorry," he would say. "She's gone peacefully. Her old heart just couldn't take it anymore." The families would rush over, devastated. But who was there to catch them? Dr. Shipman. He would make the tea. He would console the weeping daughters. He would handle the paperwork, urging for a quick cremation to spare them the pain. And the families, in their darkest hour, would thank him. They would send him cards. They would raise money for his surgery. He was killing their mothers and grandmothers, wiping out whole generations of matriarchs, and they were literally applauding him for it. He had achieved the ultimate killer's fantasy. He was murdering in plain sight, and his victims' families were his biggest defenders. The town of Hyde wasn't just his home, it was his graveyard, and he was the beloved caretaker. The afternoons in Hyde were usually quiet. The morning rush of school runs and shop openings had faded, settling into a lull of ticking clocks and daytime television. This was the time when the elderly women of the town, the widows and the retirees, would settle into their armchairs. They would rest their legs, perhaps knitting or dozing off, in the warmth of a gas fire. It was a time of peace. But for Harold Shipman, the afternoon was hunting time. His surgery hours would end. The last patient would leave with a prescription in hand, and the doctor would check his list. He wasn't checking for sick calls. He was checking for opportunities. He didn't wait to be summoned. He created the appointment himself. He would drive his car through the damp streets, parking a little way down the road, and walk to the front door of his chosen victim. The knock was never aggressive. It was the familiar, rhythmic rap of a friend. When the door opened, the reaction was always the same: surprise, followed by delight. "Dr. Shipman, I wasn't expecting you." He would smile, stepping inside, bringing the cold air with him. "Just passing by, love. Thought I'd check on that blood pressure. Can't be too careful." They would usher him in, flattered that the busy doctor had taken time out of his day just for them. They would offer him tea, biscuits, treating him like royalty. They didn't see the predator checking the layout of the room, noting who was home, ensuring they were alone. The ritual was terrifyingly consistent. He would sit, chat, and play the part of the caring physician perfectly. Then he would suggest it. "You're looking a bit peaky today," he might say, or "Your heart sounds a little tired. I've got something new in the bag. A little pick-me-up. It'll give you a boost." He never used medical jargon that might alarm them. He used gentle, comforting words. A pick-me-up. It sounded like a vitamin shot, a tonic. They trusted him. Why wouldn't they? He had cured their husbands, treated their grandchildren. So they would roll up the sleeve of a cardigan or a blouse, exposing the thin, papery skin of their arm. Shipman didn't tremble. He didn't sweat. He would draw up the diamorphine, medical-grade heroin, and slide the needle in. It wasn't a small dose. It was massive, lethal. The effect was almost instantaneous. The victim wouldn't gasp or struggle. Their eyes might widen for a fraction of a second as the chemical sledgehammer hit their system, shutting down the respiratory center in the brain. The cup of tea might slip from their hand, or their head might simply loll forward onto their chest. And just like that, they were gone. A life of 70 or 80 years, filled with memories, wars, loves, and losses, extinguished in the time it takes to blink. But the horror didn't end with the death. This is where the true monster revealed itself. Shipman didn't flee the scene in a panic. He stayed. He was alone in the house with the fresh corpse of a woman who had trusted him. He would rearrange the body. He often propped them up in the armchair, tilting their head back to make it look like they had simply fallen asleep while watching TV. He created a tableau of a peaceful natural death. The silence in the room would be deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the mantel clock, and there sat Shipman, observing his handiwork. Then, the looting would begin. It wasn't about the money. He was a well-paid GP with a good pension. It was about the trophy. He would rummage through their purses, taking a handful of cash. He would open jewelry boxes, pocketing a ring or a cheap necklace. These were trinkets, souvenirs of his power. He was taking a piece of them with him. He would often leave the house with the stolen goods in his pocket, stepping out the front door and locking it behind him. If a neighbor walked by, he would nod and wave. "Just checking on Mrs. Smith," he'd say cheerfully. "She's having a nap." He would walk back to his car, get in, and drive away, leaving the dead woman sitting in her chair, waiting to be found by a horrified daughter or a neighbor later that evening. And when the call finally came to the surgery, "Doctor, I can't wake Mum up," he would act surprised. He would rush back to the scene, certify the death he had caused hours earlier, and console the grieving family, sometimes while the stolen ring was still in his pocket. In a town as tightly knit as Hyde, death is a business with its own rhythm. The local undertakers knew the families, the streets, and the doctors. They knew that winter brought the flu and a spike in funerals, and that summer usually offered a reprieve. But in the late 90s, the staff at Frank Massey & Son, the local funeral parlor, began to notice a disturbance in that rhythm. It wasn't a sudden wave of illness or a harsh winter. It was something far more specific and far more unsettling. It was the sheer volume of bodies coming from one specific source, the surgery of Dr. Harold Shipman. Debbie Brambro, a sharp and observant woman working at the parlor, was the first to feel the prickle of unease on the back of her neck. It started as a whisper in her mind, a pattern that didn't make sense. She would go to collect a body, and there they would be, an elderly woman, fully dressed, sitting upright in her favorite chair, looking for all the world like she was waiting for a cup of tea. It happened once, then twice, then again and again. "It's Dr. Shipman's lot again," they would mutter in the back of the hearse. It defied the logic of natural death. Terminally ill people, people with the bad hearts Shipman always cited, didn't usually die sitting up in their day clothes. They died in bed, in their pajamas, after a decline. Shipman's patients seemed to be dropping dead in the middle of their lives, frozen in time. The unease grew until it could no longer be contained within the walls of the funeral home. Debbie raised her concerns. She spoke to her father, Frank Massey. They looked at their ledgers. The numbers were staggering. Shipman wasn't just losing patients. He was losing them at a rate that dwarfed every other doctor in the area combined. Compelled by a moral duty that outweighed the fear of accusing a respected professional, Frank Massey took the dangerous step of approaching another. Doctor. He went to Dr. Linda Reynolds from the Brooks Surgery, a practice just across the road from Shipman's fortress. Dr. Reynolds listened. She didn't dismiss the undertaker as a gossip. She looked at the cremation forms, the ash cash forms that doctors had to countersign. The pile for Shipman was a mountain compared to the molehills of her other colleagues. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The statistics were impossible. She contacted the coroner, who in turn contacted the police. This was the moment. This was the pivotal fracture in time where the monster could have been stopped. A covert investigation was launched. Detectives were assigned. They had the scent. But Shipman was ready. He was a creature of documentation, a master of the bureaucratic lie. When the police came asking questions, they didn't kick down his door or drag him into an interrogation room. They treated him with the deference due a senior medical professional. They asked to see his records. And there was Shipman's genius. He hadn't just killed, he had rewritten history. Late at night, the blue glow of his computer screen illuminating his face. He had been altering the medical notes of his victims. He inserted false entries, retroactive lies about chest pains, angina, and failing health that never existed. He created a digital paper trail that perfectly justified every death. The police, lacking medical expertise and perhaps too awed by the doctor's status, looked at the screen and saw what they were meant to see: a caring doctor dealing with a sickly population. They saw the evidence of heart conditions and natural causes. They didn't check the computer's hard drive history to see when those notes were written. They didn't notice the entries made hours after the patients were dead. They accepted the doctor's word. The investigation was closed. Shipman was cleared. He must have watched them leave his surgery with a sense of godlike exhilaration. He had looked the law in the eye, and the law had blinked. He had committed the perfect crimes, and when the spotlight finally swung his way, he had danced right through it. Instead of being a warning, the failed investigation was a green light. He felt invincible. He believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than his colleagues, smarter than the system. The undertakers went back to their work, silenced by the official ruling, but the bodies kept coming. The good doctor was now unleashed, his arrogance supercharged, and his most brazen, careless, and final murder was just around the corner. June 1998. The summer sun was trying to break through the clouds over Hyde, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, but for Harold Shipman, the season didn't matter. He was living in a perpetual winter of the soul, a cold, calculated world where he was the only inhabitant that mattered. After the police had come and gone, sniffing around his practice and leaving with their tails between their legs, a dangerous transformation had taken place within him. The caution that had once guided his hand evaporated. It was replaced by a hubris so towering, so blinding, that he began to believe he could bend reality itself to his will. He didn't just want to control death anymore. He wanted to profit from it in a way that would scream his dominance to the world. He was bored with the petty theft of rings and 10-pound notes. He wanted a grand prize. Enter Kathleen Grundy. At 81 years old, Kathleen was not the frail, bedridden invalid that Shipman usually preyed upon. She was a force of nature. A former mayor of Hyde, a wealthy, active, and deeply respected woman who was as sharp as a tack. She drove her own car, did her own shopping, and was the lifeblood of local charities. To the people of Hyde, she was an institution. To Harold Shipman, she was a challenge. And, more importantly, she was a bank vault waiting to be cracked. He had treated her for years, but on the morning of June 24th, he arrived at her beautiful, Stone Cottage not to heal, but to harvest. He had called earlier, inventing a story about a routine blood test. It was a lie, of course. Kathleen was in excellent health, but she trusted her doctor. Why would she doubt the man who had been a pillar of the community for 2 decades? He arrived early, his bag heavy with the tools of his trade. The house was immaculate, a testament to a life well lived. He sat her down on the sofa, perhaps making a joke about the weather or the local news, disarming her with that familiar, bearded smile. And then, the needle. It was quick, brutal. He injected a massive dose of diamorphine, enough to kill a man twice her size. He watched the light go out in the eyes of the town's matriarch, and just like that, Kathleen Grundy was gone. But the murder was just the prologue to the real crime, the act that would finally unravel the tapestry of lies he had spent a lifetime weaving. Shipman didn't just leave the house with a stolen trinket this time. He went back to his surgery, to his sanctuary of deceit, and sat down at his brother typewriter. He began to type, but he wasn't typing medical notes. He was typing a last will and testament. It was a clumsy, almost childish forgery, written in a style that screamed of haste and arrogance. The document was short, blunt, and completely out of character for the meticulous, articulate Kathleen Grundy. I give all my estate, money, and house to my doctor. My family are not in need, and I want to reward him for all the care he has given to me and the people of Hyde. It was absurd. It was a caricature of a will. He forged her signature at the bottom, a shaky scrawl that looked nothing like her firm, elegant hand. He folded the paper, satisfied. In his twisted mind, this made perfect sense. He believed that the world loved him so much, respected him so deeply, that no one would question an 81-year-old woman leaving her entire fortune, nearly £400,000, to her GP, disinheriting her own children in the process. He thought his reputation was a shield strong enough to deflect even the most basic logic. He then took the final, fatal step. He made sure the will would be found. He didn't hide it. He practically announced it. He had sent a copy to a local firm of solicitors, pretending it had come from Kathleen herself. He sat back and waited, expecting the money to roll in, expecting the praise to continue, expecting the world to bow down to his genius. He didn't realize that he had just handed the authorities the smoking gun they had failed to find months earlier. He had targeted the wrong woman, and he had made the mistake of assuming that everyone else was as blinded by his mask as he was. He had underestimated the power of a daughter's love and the sharp, legal mind of the woman who was about to receive that letter. The game was about to change. Angela Woodruff was not a woman easily fooled. As a solicitor in the town of Warwick, she spent her days dissecting lies, navigating the complex architecture of legal documents, and ensuring that truth was set in stone. She was sharp, meticulous, and fiercely protective of her mother, Kathleen. When the call came that Kathleen had died suddenly, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It didn't make sense. Her mother was 81, yes, but she was a dynamo, a woman who walked with purpose, whose mind was as clear as a bell, and who had never shown a sign of slowing down. To hear that she had simply faded away, sitting on her sofa, felt wrong, like a jarring note in a familiar song. But the doctor, the revered Dr. Shipman, was so certain. He spoke with such grave authority about old age and sudden failure. Angela, in her grief, buried her doubts along with her mother in the damp earth of the Hyde Cemetery. But the dead do not always stay silent. A few weeks later, A letter arrived on Angela's desk that would drag the truth screaming from the grave. It was from a local firm of solicitors, Hamilton Ward, claiming they were in possession of Kathleen Grundy's last will and testament. Angela frowned. She handled her mother's legal affairs. She knew her mother's wishes. She had drafted her mother's will years ago, a meticulously crafted document that left her estate to her children and grandchildren. What was this new document? She opened the envelope, and as her eyes scanned the paper, confusion turned to cold, hard ice in her veins. The document before her was a mockery. It was typed on a cheap typewriter, the ink uneven, the formatting amateurish. The language was bizarre, blunt, unsophisticated sentences that sounded nothing like the articulate, educated woman Kathleen was. "I leave everything to my doctor," it read. It was absurd. It was grotesque. And then, the signature. Angela stared at the scrawl at the bottom of the page. It was shaky, large, and completely unlike the precise, elegant signature she had seen on birthday cards and legal papers her entire life. It was a forgery, and it wasn't even a good one. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a clumsy, arrogant attempt at theft. Angela realized with a sickening lurch that the man who had signed the death certificate was now trying to sign the checks. The good doctor was a thief. And if he was a thief, willing to forge a will to steal a fortune, what else was he capable of? The nagging doubt about her mother's sudden death roared back to life. No longer a whisper, but a scream. She didn't hesitate. She didn't call the surgery to ask for an explanation. She went straight to the police. This time, the reception was different. The detectives at the Greater Manchester Police, led by Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles, looked at the will. They saw what Angela saw. They saw the motive, greed, pure and simple, staring them in the face. The sanctity of the doctor's white coat began to dissolve under the harsh light of forensic suspicion. They realized that if Shipman had forged the will, he had a reason to ensure Kathleen died when she did. The timing was too perfect. The pick-me-up visit, the sudden death, the immediate production of the will. It was a linear path of destruction. The investigation that had been asleep for months suddenly woke up with a vengeance. But to prove murder, they needed more than a bad typing job. They needed the body. They needed to ask Kathleen Grundy one last question. The decision was made to exhume her. It is a grim, heavy business, disturbing the rest of the dead, but it was necessary. Under the cover of darkness, with police tape fluttering in the wind and floodlights cutting through the gloom of the cemetery, the earth was turned back. The coffin was raised. It was a scene of Gothic horror meeting modern justice. As the dirt was brushed away, the detectives weren't just looking for a cause of death. They were looking for a chemical fingerprint. Shipman had always claimed his victims died of old age, their hearts simply giving out. But if Angela was right, if the will was the key, then Kathleen's body would hold a secret. It would be saturated with the weapon. The samples were taken and rushed to the lab. The police waited, the town waited, and Angela Woodruff waited, praying that her mother would finally speak the truth that would bring the monster down. The silence of the grave was about to be broken by the screaming evidence of morphine. The toxicology report that came back from the lab was not a document. It was a thunderclap. The scientists had analyzed the muscle tissue taken from Kathleen Grundy's exhumed body, and the results were unequivocal. There was no heart failure. There was no stroke. Her system was saturated with diamorphine. It was a dose so massive it would have killed a seasoned addict, let alone an 81-year-old woman who had never touched a recreational drug in her life. The substance that Shipman had used to ease his patient's passing was exactly what killed them. For the detectives, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening finality. The good doctor hadn't just forged a will. He had executed the testator to cash it in. But the horror was just beginning to unfurl. If Shipman had killed Kathleen Grundy with a lethal injection, what about the others? What about the hundreds of elderly women who had died suddenly in their chairs, the ones he had so helpfully cremated? The police widened their net. They began to look at the other deaths certified by Shipman in the recent months. They ordered more exhumations. The quiet cemetery in Hyde became a crime scene. The peace of the dead disturbed night after night as coffin after coffin was raised from the earth. And in each one, the story was the same. Morphine, morphine, morphine. It was a production line of death, a massacre hidden behind the veneer of medical care. While the graves were giving up their secrets, the detectives turned their attention to the weapon Shipman believed was his shield. His computer. He had always prided himself on being a modern doctor, keeping meticulous digital records. When the police had first questioned him, he had pointed to these records as proof of his patient's poor health. "Look," he would say, pointing to the screen. "Mrs. Grundy complained of chest pains here, and here, and here." It seemed airtight. But Shipman, for all his arrogance, was technologically illiterate. He didn't understand how computers actually worked. Forensic computer analysts took his hard drive apart, bit by bit. They discovered that the medical software he used didn't just store text, it stored time. Every keystroke, every edit, every save had a digital fingerprint. And what they found was chilling. The notes detailing Kathleen Grundy's deteriorating health and addiction symptoms hadn't been written over months or years. They had been created in a frenzy of typing hours after she was already dead. He had killed her, come back to the surgery, and then rewritten her medical history to justify the murder. He had done the same for victim after victim. He was fabricating illnesses for ghosts. The computer, which he thought was his accomplice, became his accuser. It showed the exact moment he decided to cover his tracks. Then came the raid on his home. In a messy, cluttered room, they found it. A Brother typewriter. It was dusty, unassuming, a relic of an older time. But when they typed a sample and compared it to the forged will, it was a perfect match. The chipped letter, E, the misalignment of the T, it was as unique as a fingerprint. He hadn't even bothered to get rid of it. He was so certain of his own genius, so contemptuous of the police's ability to catch him, that he had kept the very machine he used to try and steal a fortune. Shipman was brought in for interrogation. The detective sat across from him, armed with the toxicology reports, the computer logs, and the typewriter analysis. They expected him to crumble. They expected the mask to slip. But Shipman did something that unnerved even the most hardened officers. He sat there, his back straight, his eyes cold and dead behind his glasses, and he treated them with utter disdain. He didn't confess. He didn't cry. He closed his eyes and turned his chair away from them, literally turning his back on the evidence. When he did speak, it was to spin lies that were so offensive they made the detective's skin crawl. He claimed Kathleen Grundy, the respectable former mayor, was a secret junkie. He said she was addicted to morphine and that he had been managing her habit. It was a lie so grotesque, so disrespectful to the woman he had murdered, that it showed the true depth of his depravity. He wasn't just a killer. He was a narcissist who believed he could rewrite reality itself. But the evidence was a tidal wave, and no amount of arrogance could stop it from crashing down on him. The trial began in October 1999 at Preston Crown Court, a grand, imposing building that would serve as the final arena for the man who had played God for decades. The atmosphere was electric, a suffocating mix of grief, anger, and morbid curiosity. The world's press had descended on the town, their cameras trained on the entrance, waiting for a glimpse of the monster in white. But when Harold Shipman appeared in the dock, he didn't look like a monster. He looked exactly like what he was, a gray-haired, bearded, middle-aged professional in a sensible suit. He looked like a grandfather. He looked like the man you would trust to hold your baby. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Inside the courtroom, the gallery was packed with the families of the victims. These were the people who had made him tea, who had thanked him for his kindness, who had sent him Christmas cards after he had murdered their mothers and grandmothers. They sat in stunned silence, staring at the back of his head, searching for some sign of remorse, some flicker of humanity. They found none. Shipman sat in the glass-enclosed dock with an air of bored detachment. He took notes, adjusting his spectacles, looking more like a medical consultant reviewing a junior doctor's poor work than a man on trial for serial murder. He seemed to believe that this was all a terrible administrative error, a misunderstanding that he, with his superior intellect, would eventually clear up. The prosecution, led by Richard Henriquez QC, didn't rely on theatrics. They didn't need to. They had the ledger of death. They systematically dismantled the facade of the caring GP, brick by brick. They presented the computer records, projecting the digital lies onto screens for the jury to see. They showed how he had examined patients who were already dead, how he had prescribed medication to corpses. They brought out the typewriter, the physical smoking gun that linked him to the forgery. And they brought out the science, the toxicology reports that screamed of morphine overdoses in women who had no business having the drug in their systems. But the most damaging witness against Harold Shipman was Harold Shipman himself. His arrogance, which had protected him for so long, became his undoing. When he took the stand, he didn't offer the humble explanations of a misunderstood healer. He was combative. He was condescending. He argued with the prosecutor, sneering at the questions, treating the court with contempt. He stuck to his grotesque lie that Kathleen Grundy, the pillar of the community, was a secret drug addict. He tried to paint himself as the victim, a hard-working doctor persecuted by a system that didn't understand the complexities of his work. The jury watched this performance, and they didn't see a victim. They saw a narcissist who was furious that he had been caught. They saw the cold, hard eyes of a predator who viewed them all as beneath him. On January 31st, 2000, the jury returned after 6 days of deliberation. The courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood up. As the first guilty was read out for the murder of Marie West, a sob broke the silence in the public gallery. Then came the next. Guilty. And the next. Guilty. 15 times the word rang out, a bell tolling for the 15 women named on the indictment. 15 times Shipman stood impassive, his expression unchangeable, a statue of stone. He was also found guilty of forging the will. The mask had been ripped off, and the world finally saw him for what he was. Mr. Justice Forbes, the judge, did not mince his words. He looked down at the man in the dock and delivered a sentence that echoed the enormity of the crimes. He called Shipman wicked and evil, stating that he had abused the trust of his patients in the most heinous way imaginable. He sentenced him to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he never be released. "You will die in prison," was the subtext of the judgment. As Shipman was led away to the cells, he didn't look back at the weeping families. He didn't hang his head in shame. He walked with his head high, clutching his file of notes, still playing the role of the busy, important doctor, even as the heavy steel doors clanged shut behind him, sealing him in a concrete tomb of his own making. The heavy thud of the prison door didn't end the horror. It merely contained the man, while the truth of his atrocities continued to bleed out into the world like a dark stain that refused to wash away. Harold Shipman was behind bars, serving life at HMP Wakefield, a fortress designed to hold the worst of humanity. But while he sat in his cell, stripping paint from the walls and refusing to speak to therapists, the detectives outside were still counting. The 15 murders he had been convicted of were just the tip of a titanic iceberg. An official inquiry, the Shipman Inquiry, was launched to dredge the depths of his past. The investigators went back through years of records, back to his days in Pontefract, back to the very beginning. The numbers they uncovered were nauseating. It wasn't 15. It wasn't 50. The official report concluded that Harold Shipman had killed at least 215 of his patients, with a probable count of over 250. He had been killing for nearly 30 years. He had killed on holidays. He had killed on weekends. He had killed with the casual frequency of a man drinking his morning coffee. The Good Doctor was revealed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, a man who had turned the profession of healing into an industrial assembly line of death. And through it all, as the world gasped at the magnitude of his crimes, Shipman remained silent. He refused to confess. He refused to explain. He denied the families the closure they so desperately craved. In his twisted mind, his silence was his last scrap of power. As long as he didn't admit it, he was still the doctor, and they were still beneath him. He spent his days in prison with the same arrogance he had worn in his surgery. He refused to take part in rehabilitation courses. He treated the guards with disdain. He maintained a delusional facade of innocence, bolstered by the one person who stood by him, his wife, Primrose. She visited him faithfully, a small, quiet woman who refused to believe that her husband was a monster, or perhaps simply chose to look away. But as the years ticked by, the walls began to close in. It wasn't guilt that ate away at Shipman. It was the loss of control. He was a man who had decided when others died. Now, the state was deciding how he lived. And there was one final deadline approaching, one final calculation he had to make. He was 57 years old. If he lived past the age of 60, he would lose his full NHS pension, stripping his wife of her financial security. The authorities were moving to strip him of it anyway, but there was a window of time, a loophole. If he died before that window closed, the money would be hers. It was the ultimate transactional death. He began to plan his own exit with the same clinical efficiency he had used on his victims. He didn't want to die out of despair. He wanted to die to cheat the system. He wanted to rob the British justice system of the satisfaction of keeping him caged. He wanted to secure the payout. On the eve of his 58th birthday, in the cold, dark hours of the morning of January 13th, 2004, Harold Shipman prepared for his final procedure. He didn't have a syringe this time. He had bed sheets. He tore them into strips, knotting them with the dexterity of a surgeon's hands. He secured the ligature to the window bars of his cell. There was no note, no final words of remorse, no apology to the hundreds of families whose lives he had shattered. He simply stepped off the bed and let gravity do the work. When the guards found him at 6:20 a.m., the angel of death was gone. He had hanged himself. But even in suicide, it was an act of aggression. By dying when he did, his wife received a lump sum of £100,000 and a pension for life. He had played the system one last time, and he had won. He left behind a legacy of silence and a town forever scarred by his betrayal. The people of Hyde were left with their grief and their anger, denied the chance to ever hear him say, "I did it." Harold Shipman died as he lived, a cold, controlling narcissist who believed he was the only person in the universe who mattered. He took his secrets to the grave, leaving the world to stare into the void he left behind, wondering how a man could look so much like a savior while having the soul of a demon.